Greenland is often described as empty. That description has followed the island for centuries. It appears in the journals of explorers, in colonial correspondence, in strategic assessments, and in modern political commentary. It suggests absence. It implies availability. It frames Greenland as space rather than society, geography rather than history. And it is wrong. Greenland is not empty. It is vast, it is inhabited, and it carries a human history that stretches back thousands of years, older than the nations now debating its future, older than the empires that once tried to control it, older even than the maps that attempt to define it. The idea of emptiness has always served power. Lands described as empty are easier to claim, easier to trade, easier to administer. Throughout history, territories labeled vacant are rarely uninhabited. They are simply inhabited by people whose sovereignty is inconvenient. Greenland has lived inside this contradiction for most of its recorded history. In the 21st century, Greenland has become something else as well, a strategic object. It appears in defense white papers, climate models, mineral surveys, and geopolitical forecasts, but it was never neutral ground. It was never a blank slate. Every attempt to treat it as one has collided with geography, climate, and people who already lived there. To understand why Greenland keeps returning to the center of global politics, and why figures like Donald Trump speak of it in transactional terms, you have to move backward through time and follow the pattern that repeats whenever global systems begin to strain. Greenland does not attract power when the world feels stable. It attracts power when the world feels uncertain.
Long before Greenland entered European imagination, it was already inhabited by Arctic peoples who learned to survive where error is fatal. Archaeological evidence places the first human arrival in Greenland around 2500 BCE, when small groups crossed from Arctic Canada during periods of favorable climate. These early settlers are often identified with the Sakak culture, followed later by the Dorset culture. These societies were not primitive or transitional. They were refined adaptations to one of the harshest environments on Earth. They developed tools from bone and stone, navigated long periods of darkness, and structured social life around collective survival. Knowledge was not abstract. It was practical, cumulative, and essential.
Around the 12th and 13th centuries CE, another migration reached Greenland, the Thule people. Their arrival marked a technological and cultural shift. They brought advanced hunting methods, dog sleds, large skin boats, and complex social organization. They hunted whales, seals, and caribou with efficiency unmatched by earlier Arctic cultures. The Thule are the direct ancestors of today's Inuit population in Greenland, the Kalalit. Their continuity matters. Modern Greenland is not a rediscovered land. It is a continuous homeland. This continuity is often erased in external narratives. When modern leaders speak about Greenland as territory to be acquired, secured, or purchased, they rarely acknowledge that the island has never been empty. It has always been inhabited, governed by local knowledge systems long before it was governed by law.
Greenland entered European history around 986 CE, when Norse settlers from Iceland, led by Eric the Red, established colonies along the island's southwestern coast. The name Greenland itself was an act of persuasion, an early example of strategic branding meant to attract settlers to a marginal environment. For several centuries, Norse Greenland functioned as part of the medieval North Atlantic world. There were farms, churches, trade routes, and legal assemblies. Walrus ivory connected Greenland to European markets. The eastern and western settlements persisted longer than many expected. Then they vanished. By the early 15th century, the Norse presence had disappeared entirely. The last widely cited written record is a wedding held at Walsee in 1408. After that, silence.
The reasons remain debated. Climate cooling during the Little Ice Age reduced agricultural viability, Trade routes shifted, isolation deepened, disease, conflict, and economic decline likely combined. What is clear is that European methods of settlement proved fragile in Greenland's environment. Greenland tolerated presence. It tested permanence. This lesson would repeat. For nearly 3 centuries after the Norse disappearance, European contact with Greenland was intermittent. Whalers and explorers visited its coasts, but no permanent European settlement endured. Greenland receded into myth, rumor, and marginal trade. That changed in 1721. In that year, Hans Aged, a Lutheran missionary acting on behalf of the Danish-Norwegian crown, arrived in Greenland. His mission was religious. He hoped to find and convert the descendants of the vanished Norse settlers. He found ruins instead, and Inuit communities who had lived continuously on the land.
Egede's mission failed in its stated purpose, but it succeeded politically. It reinserted Greenland into European imperial systems. From this point onward, Greenland ceased to be a distant curiosity. It became an administered territory. Danish-Norwegian authorities established missions, trading posts, and eventually monopolies that controlled economic life. Contact with the outside world was filtered through Copenhagen. Greenland was governed as a dependency, not a partner. In 1776, Denmark formalized a trade monopoly that shaped Greenland's economy for generations. This monopoly restricted external trade and centralized authority. Greenland's integration into global systems occurred on terms defined elsewhere. In 1814, the Treaty of Kiel reshaped Scandinavia after the Napoleonic Wars. Denmark lost Norway to Sweden. Greenland remained under Danish sovereignty. This legal detail would later become foundational. Greenland's modern political status rests on this treaty.
For most of the 19th century, Greenland remained peripheral to global politics. Its environment was hostile. Its population was small. Its economic value appeared limited. That changed abruptly in the 20th century. World War II transformed Greenland from colonial periphery into strategic asset. In April 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Denmark. Greenland was cut off from its governing state. The United States moved quickly to secure the island's strategic position in the North Atlantic. American forces established airfields, weather stations, and logistical facilities. Greenland became essential to transatlantic aviation and weather forecasting. For the first time, the United States developed a direct operational relationship with the island. That relationship did not end when the war did.
In 1946, as Cold War tensions crystallized, the United States offered to purchase Greenland from Denmark for $100 million in gold. Denmark refused. But the offer revealed strategic urgency. Greenland sat along the shortest routes between North America and the Soviet Union. Control promised early warning and forward positioning. Ownership failed. Presence succeeded. In 1951, Denmark and the United States signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement. American military presence was formalized. Greenland became part of NATO's northern defense architecture. The most visible result was Thule Air Base, constructed in the early 1950s. The base supported radar systems, bomber operations, and later missile warning networks. Greenland became a front line in a conflict defined by deterrence. The cost was borne locally.
In 1953, Inuit communities near Thule were forcibly relocated to make room for the expanding base. Families were moved without meaningful consent. This displacement left a lasting scar in Greenlandic political memory. Cold War secrecy deepened distrust. In 1968, a U.S. B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule, scattering radioactive material. Cleanup followed, but confidence eroded. Strategic necessity once again overrode local agency. By the late Cold War period, Greenland occupied a paradoxical position. It was central to global security planning, yet marginal in political voice. Decisions affecting its land and people were made far away, justified by threats beyond the horizon. This imbalance could not persist. In 1979, Greenlanders voted in favor of home rule. Authority over education, healthcare, and local governance transferred from Copenhagen to Nuuk. It was not independence,
but it was irreversible.
In 1985, Greenland withdrew from the European Economic Community following a referendum, prioritizing control over fisheries. In 2009, the Self-Government Act expanded autonomy further, recognizing Greenlanders as a people under international law and affirming the legal path to independence. As Greenland's political agency increased, so did its strategic relevance. Climate change reopened the Arctic, sea ice retreated, shipping routes lengthened their seasons, military planners returned north. Deposits of rare earth elements and other critical minerals attracted global attention. China declared itself a near-Arctic state. Russia expanded Arctic military infrastructure. The United States reassessed northern defense. Greenland stood at the intersection of all three. When Donald Trump spoke about buying Greenland, he was not inventing interest, he was revealing anxiety. Ownership language resurfaced because access no longer felt secure. Influence no longer felt sufficient.
Greenland's past explains why this anxiety keeps returning. It is not empty. It is not passive. And it has never been merely land. It is history under pressure. The political transformation of Greenland in the mid-20th century marked another turning point. In 1953, Denmark formally ended Greenland's colonial status and incorporated the island into the Danish constitution. Greenlanders became Danish citizens. On paper, this was presented as integration and equality. In practice, it produced mixed outcomes. Citizenship brought expanded access to welfare systems, education, and healthcare. It also accelerated cultural displacement. Danish language dominated administration and schooling. Urbanization policies reshaped settlement patterns. Traditional livelihoods were increasingly marginalized in favor of wage labor and centralized services. Modernization arrived rapidly and unevenly.
For many Greenlanders, the pace of change felt imposed rather than chosen. Social disruption followed. Alcohol abuse, housing shortages, and cultural dislocation emerged as serious challenges. These consequences were not accidental. They reflected a development model designed elsewhere, optimized for efficiency rather than continuity. By the 1960s and 1970s, Greenlandic political consciousness had matured. Cultural revival movements emphasized language, history, and identity. Political activism focused on self-determination, not isolation. Greenlanders did not reject the modern world. They demanded authority within it. The Home Rule referendum of 1979 was the result. This shift altered Greenland's relationship with external power. It introduced a new variable into every strategic calculation: consent. As autonomy expanded, Greenland's global position changed. External actors could no longer deal exclusively with Copenhagen. They increasingly had to engage new.
This became especially visible in the early 21st century as climate change accelerated. Greenland's ice sheet, once treated as immutable, began to lose mass at unprecedented rates. Scientific research intensified. Global attention followed. Greenland became central to climate modeling and sea level projections. Its environment was no longer remote. It was consequential. At the same time, geological surveys highlighted Greenland's mineral potential. Rare earth elements, essential to modern technology, batteries, wind turbines, advanced electronics, were identified in multiple locations. Extraction remained difficult, environmentally contentious, and politically sensitive. But potential reshaped perception. States plan around futures, not present realities. As global supply chains fractured and strategic competition intensified, Greenland's resources gained symbolic and practical importance. Control over materials became a question of national security.
This context matters for understanding modern geopolitical language. When leaders speak about Greenland in terms of security, investment, or ownership, they are responding not only to geography, but to systemic fragility. Climate change, technological dependence, and geopolitical rivalry converge on the island. Greenland's past shows what happens when external power treats it as solution rather than society. The Norse failed to adapt. Colonial administrators imposed control. Cold War planners prioritized secrecy. Each phase left residue. Today, Greenland's leaders navigate with memory. They balance engagement with caution. They seek development without dependency, autonomy without isolation, and relevance without subordination. Greenland's history is not a prelude. It is a warning. The island has never been empty. It has never been passive, and it has never been immune to the consequences of external ambition.
That is why Greenland keeps returning to the center of global politics. Not because it seeks power, but because power keeps seeking it. This recurring attention reveals a deeper truth about global order. Greenland becomes visible when the world is uncertain. When systems feel reliable, its isolation protects it from scrutiny. When trust erodes, between states, within markets, across institutions, Greenland's position transforms from peripheral to essential. This is not unique to the present era. In medieval Europe, Greenland mattered when expansion pushed limits. During colonial consolidation, it mattered when empires sought coherence. In the Cold War, it mattered when nuclear strategy compressed geography. Today, it matters because climate change and technological dependence have reopened questions thought settled. Geography never disappeared. It waited.
Greenland's vastness magnifies this effect. It is the world's largest island, yet one of its least populated. This imbalance invites projection. Outsiders see scale and imagine control. History shows the opposite. Scale amplifies vulnerability as much as opportunity. Infrastructure is expensive. Distances are unforgiving. Environment resists standardization. These constraints shape politics. They limit how quickly extraction can proceed. They complicate military permanence. They demand local knowledge. Greenland's past is filled with moments where external power underestimated these limits. Each time, consequences followed. The lesson Greenland offers is not about ambition. It is about humility. Modern geopolitics often treats territory as static. Greenland is dynamic. Its ice moves, its coastlines shift, its conditions evolve. Power that ignores this reality repeats earlier mistakes. This is why Greenland cannot be understood as a prize. It must be understood as a process.
A process shaped by history, by memory. The past does not disappear in Greenland. It accumulates, and that accumulation shapes every modern decision made about the island, whether spoken openly or quietly assumed. Greenland's history does not explain everything, but without it, nothing about the present makes sense. Beyond settlement patterns and political control, Greenland's history is also a history of worldview. For Inuit societies, land was never owned in the European sense. It was inhabited, traveled, remembered, and respected. Ice, sea, animals, and weather were not resources to be extracted, but systems to be understood. Knowledge was embedded in stories, seasonal cycles, and communal memory. Survival depended on restraint as much as skill. This worldview clashed fundamentally with European administrative logic.
Where colonial governance sought permanence, Inuit life was adaptive. Where European systems valued enclosure, Inuit systems valued movement. Where empires mapped territory, Inuit societies navigated it. These differences shaped every later misunderstanding. When Denmark intensified assimilation policies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the goal was not destruction, but integration. Yet integration operated on unequal terms. Danish language became the medium of authority. Education systems privileged European knowledge. Greenlandic traditions were tolerated, but rarely centered. By the mid-20th century, this imbalance deepened. Post-war modernization programs accelerated housing construction, centralized settlements, and expanded wage labor. The intent was to improve living standards. The consequence was rapid cultural displacement. Communities that had organized life around seasonal rhythms were reorganized around bureaucratic schedules.
Language loss followed. Identity strain followed. Social stress followed. Alcohol abuse, mental health crises, and dislocation became visible symptoms of a transition imposed too quickly. These consequences were not incidental. They were structural. They reflected a development model that prioritized efficiency over continuity and external benchmarks over local consent. The political awakening that followed cannot be understood without this context. Greenlandic demands for home rule and later self-government were not reactions to abstract colonialism. They were responses to lived disruption. Autonomy became a way to slow change, regain agency, and restore dignity. Cultural revival accompanied political reform. Greenlandic language reasserted itself in education and governance. Historical narratives were reclaimed. Traditional knowledge gained recognition alongside scientific expertise. This revival did not reject modernity. It sought balance within it.
As climate change accelerates, this worldview has returned to relevance. Greenland's ice sheet is not only a symbol of environmental crisis, it is a living system that responds unpredictably to global forces. Scientific models struggle to capture its complexity. Indigenous knowledge complements measurement by providing long-term observational insight. This convergence of knowledge systems is not incidental, it is necessary. Modern geopolitics increasingly confronts limits, ecological, logistical, social. Greenland's past illustrates what happens when those limits are ignored. Empires misread the land. Cold War planners misread the ice. Modern investors risk misreading society. Each error produces cost. Greenland's long history offers a counterpoint to narratives of inevitability. It shows that power does not simply impose outcomes. It negotiates with environment, culture, and memory, often unsuccessfully. This is why Greenland resists reduction to a strategic asset.
It is not merely where systems intersect. It is where assumptions are tested. The island's past is not a sequence of failures or triumphs. It is a record of adaptation under pressure. That record matters now. As external interest intensifies once again, Greenland brings to the table more than resources or location. It brings historical awareness. It remembers what happens when urgency overrides consent and when ambition ignores context. This memory does not guarantee protection, but it does shape resistance. Greenland's story, taken as a whole, suggests a final lesson. History does not move in straight lines. It accumulates. And in Greenland, accumulation carries weight. Denmark, empire, and the first American shadow. By the early 18th century, Greenland had already passed through centuries of external attention and retreat. What changed in 1721 was not discovery, but permanence.
When Hans Egede arrived on Greenland's southwest coast on behalf of the Danish-Norwegian crown, his stated aim was religious. His lasting impact was political. Egede's mission marked the beginning of continuous European administration after centuries of intermittent contact. From that point forward, Greenland became an administered territory rather than a distant frontier. Danish authorities established missions, trading posts, and eventually a formal trade monopoly. Economic life was centralized, external contact was regulated, and governance flowed outward from Copenhagen. The legal foundations of this relationship were solidified in 1814, when the Treaty of Kiel transferred Norway to Sweden, while Greenland remained under Danish sovereignty. This decision anchored Greenland's political status in international law and shaped every later debate over sovereignty and autonomy.
For much of the 19th century, Greenland remained peripheral to global politics. Its environment discouraged settlement, and its economic value appeared limited. That condition ended abruptly in the 20th century. World War II transformed Greenland's role. After Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940, Greenland was cut off from its governing state. The United States moved quickly to secure the island's strategic position in the North Atlantic, establishing airfields and weather stations essential to transatlantic aviation and military planning. This wartime presence became permanent after the war. In 1946, the United States offered to purchase Greenland. Denmark refused, but the proposal revealed Greenland's emerging role in Cold War strategy. Control of the island promised early warning, forward positioning, and reduced vulnerability in a nuclear age. Ownership was denied. Access was secured.
The 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement formalized American military presence and integrated Greenland into NATO's Northern Defense Architecture. The construction of Thule Air Base in the early 1950s made Greenland a frontline installation in global deterrence. This transformation carried a cost. Inuit communities near Thule were forcibly relocated in 1953, creating a lasting grievance in Greenlandic political memory. Strategic necessity once again outweighed local consent. By the late Cold War period, Greenland occupied a paradoxical position, central to global security planning, yet marginal in political voice. Decisions shaping its land and future were made elsewhere, justified by threats far beyond the horizon. That imbalance set the conditions for the political changes that followed. Autonomy, self-government, and the Arctic reawakening.
By the late 20th century, Greenland faced a contradiction that could no longer be ignored. The island carried growing strategic importance, yet its political authority remained limited. Decisions about land use, security, and development were still shaped primarily outside Greenland, even as their consequences were felt locally. The post-war modernization of Greenland expanded infrastructure, healthcare, and education, but it also accelerated cultural disruption. Development arrived faster than consent. Danish language and norms dominated administration, while traditional livelihoods were increasingly marginalized. By the 1960s and 1970s, this imbalance produced political awareness. Greenlanders did not reject modernization. They rejected exclusion from decisions about it.
This pressure culminated in the 1979 Home Rule referendum. Authority over education, healthcare, and local governance shifted from Copenhagen to Nuuk. Home Rule did not end Danish sovereignty, but it permanently altered the direction of power. The shift continued. In 1985, Greenland withdrew from the European Economic Community following a referendum, prioritizing control over fisheries. This decision signaled that Greenland's political instincts did not align neatly with those of its governing state. The most consequential transformation came in 2009 with the Self-Governance Act. Greenland assumed control over policing, courts, and natural resources. Greenlanders were recognized as a people under international law, and the legal path to independence was affirmed. From this point forward, Greenland was no longer merely an autonomous territory. It was a potential sovereign state. Independence, however, carried constraints.
Greenland's small population, extreme infrastructure costs, and narrow economic base made financial viability central to political debate. Independence required revenue, and revenue pointed toward resources. As climate change accelerated, Arctic ice retreated and accessibility expanded. Greenland's environment began to shift from barrier to interface. Shipping routes lengthened their seasons. Geological surveys highlighted deposits of rare earth elements and other strategic minerals. This environmental transformation reshaped perception. Greenland was no longer seen only through Denmark. It became visible to the world. In the 2010s, China expanded its Arctic engagement and explored economic partnerships in Greenland. Russia reinforced Arctic military infrastructure along its northern coast. The United States reassessed northern defense. Greenland found itself at the intersection of these pressures.
It sought development without dependence, autonomy without isolation, independence without instability. This balancing act defined Greenland's reemergence into global politics, territory, influence, and the return of ownership thinking. For much of the late 20th century, global power operated through influence rather than possession. Markets expanded, alliances replaced empires, and access mattered more than ownership. Geography appeared secondary to networks. That assumption weakened in the early 21st century. Supply chains fractured under stress. Energy routes became leverage. Technology ecosystems split into competing standards. Infrastructure, once treated as neutral, became strategic. Geography returned. Greenland sits at the center of this correction, not because it is remote, but because it connects systems now under strain. The Arctic is no longer imagined primarily as wilderness. It is treated as infrastructure.
Air routes over the pole shorten response times. Submarine corridors gain strategic depth. Satellite and missile warning systems depend on high-latitude positioning. Greenland anchors all of these functions. During periods of cooperation, access was sufficient. Bases could operate under agreement. Presence did not require possession. As rivalry intensified, access began to feel provisional. Agreements could be revised. Governments could change. Neutrality could harden into resistance. Ownership, by contrast, promised certainty. This logic did not emerge from expansionist ambition, but from strategic anxiety. It reflects a system that no longer trusts permanence to cooperation alone. Greenland exposes this anxiety with clarity. Its location cannot be replicated. If access were constrained, alternatives would be costly and incomplete. This reality magnifies concern even when immediate threats are absent.
Beyond military planning, Greenland sits within a struggle over materials critical to modern economies. Rare earth elements and other strategic minerals shape industrial autonomy and technological resilience. Extraction remains difficult and politically sensitive, but potential alone reshapes planning. States position themselves around future constraints, not present output. Climate change compresses timelines. Ice retreat accelerates access. Permafrost loss threatens infrastructure. Environmental volatility complicates long-term planning. These pressures favor decisive language over cautious diplomacy. Donald Trump's interest in Greenland reflected this shift. His framing stripped away diplomatic restraint and revealed a raw logic. Uncertainty should be eliminated rather than managed. The language shocked. The instinct did not. Similar concerns now appear, more quietly, in Arctic strategies, mineral policies, and infrastructure planning across multiple governments.
The vocabulary has shifted. Greenland now operates in an environment where attention brings opportunity and pressure in equal measure. Strategic relevance increases leverage, but it also narrows choice. This is the terrain Greenland must navigate. Engagement without dependency. Relevance without subordination. The forces driving this attention are structural, not temporary. Power anxiety and strategic constraint. Post-Cold War power rested on confidence. Military dominance, economic scale, and institutional leadership created an expectation of predictable outcomes. Influence was assumed to be sufficient. That expectation weakened. In the early 21st century, capability and certainty began to diverge. Military power remained vast, but political outcomes became harder to secure. Economic interdependence created leverage rather than stability. Institutions endured, but trust declined. Power persisted, control did not.
This gap defines the context in which Greenland now appears. Strategic anxiety does not emerge from weakness alone. It emerges from mismatch. When systems designed for dominance confront environments that resist predictability, Greenland concentrates this mismatch. Its importance lies not in present production, but in future constraint. It sits at the intersection of military planning, climate transformation, and technological dependence. When uncertainty rises, such intersections attract attention. Ownership language reemerges in these moments. Not as ideology, as insurance. Donald Trump's framing stripped away diplomatic restraint and revealed this instinct. His language shocked because it was explicit. The logic beneath it was familiar. Trump did not invent the anxiety. He made it visible. This matters because the forces drawing attention to Greenland will persist regardless of leadership. Arctic access will continue to expand. Strategic competition will continue to intensify. Supply chains will remain fragile. Greenland will continue to matter. For Greenland, this attention creates pressure rather than threat. The risk is not seizure, but constraint. Choices narrowed by strategic urgency. Greenland's political institutions are aware of this history. Memory tempers engagement. Development is pursued cautiously. External partnerships are diversified. Greenland's challenge is not to avoid power, but to coexist with it without being absorbed. This is the condition of small societies in eras of uncertainty. Greenland as mirror. Conclusion. Greenland does not seek the role it has acquired. It does not project power or dictate rules. Yet it repeatedly returns to the center of global attention whenever international systems strain. This pattern is not accidental.
Greenland sits where systems intersect. Geography, security, climate, and economics converge on the island in ways that magnify consequence. When these systems feel stable, Greenland recedes. When they fracture, it becomes visible. This has happened before. What Greenland reveals about modern power is not ambition, but anxiety. Great powers still possess enormous capabilities, yet they struggle to guarantee outcomes. Influence no longer assures control. Agreements feel provisional. Trust erodes faster than institutions adapt. In this environment, territory regains symbolic weight, not because land itself has changed, but because certainty has. Donald Trump's interest in Greenland did not create this condition, it exposed it. His language stripped away restraint and made visible an instinct shared more broadly. When influence feels fragile, ownership feels safe. Greenland's response has been cautious.
The island is no longer marginal, but it is not passive. Its leaders balance engagement with restraint, memory with pragmatism. They seek relevance without dependence, and autonomy without isolation. This is not a resolved story. Greenland is not for sale. The Arctic is not settled. Power has not stabilized. The story pauses instead at a moment of adjustment. Greenland remains where it has always been, between systems, between pressures, and between futures. Cold War Arctic operations and the militarization of the High North expanded. Greenland did not drift into the Cold War. It was pulled into it by geometry. By the late 1940s, American and Soviet strategists confronted the same inescapable fact. The shortest path between the two superpowers ran across the Arctic. Long-range bombers and later intercontinental ballistic missiles would not travel east-west across oceans. They would travel north, over the pole. Greenland sat directly beneath those arcs.
This single geographic reality transformed the island from colonial periphery into strategic fulcrum. Distance collapsed. Warning time became survival time. Minutes mattered. In the early years of the Cold War, nuclear strategy depended on detection. Before missiles, bombers were the primary delivery system for nuclear weapons. Detecting them early meant the difference between retaliation and annihilation. Greenland became indispensable. In the early 1950s, the United States, in cooperation with Canada, began constructing the Distant Early Warning Line, known as the DEW Line. This vast network of radar stations stretched from Alaska, across northern Canada, and into Greenland. Its purpose was blunt: detect incoming Soviet bombers as early as possible. Greenland formed the eastern anchor of this system. Radar installations, communications hubs, and airfields were established across inhospitable terrain. These sites operated under extreme conditions: months of darkness, brutal cold, isolation, and constant logistical strain. Their personnel rotated in and out, but the infrastructure remained. At the center of this system stood Thule Air Base. Constructed in the early 1950s, Thule was far more than a runway in the ice. It was an integrated node linking radar detection, interceptor aircraft, command and control systems, and eventually space monitoring. From Thule, the United States could observe polar approaches and reduce warning time against a Soviet attack. This integration tied Greenland directly into the logic of nuclear deterrence. But deterrence assumed stability. Greenland did not provide it. Much of the Cold War infrastructure built on the island assumed ice was static. It was not.
One of the most ambitious and revealing projects was Project Iceworm. Conceived in the late 1950s, Iceworm proposed building a vast network of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, capable of housing hundreds of mobile nuclear missiles. The ice itself would serve as camouflage and protection. The plan treated ice as bedrock. In reality, the ice sheet moves, fractures, and flows. Engineers soon discovered that tunnels deformed faster than they could be maintained. Structural integrity could not be guaranteed. The project was quietly abandoned in the 1960s, but its remnants, along with radioactive and industrial waste, were left buried beneath the ice. This episode revealed a recurring pattern. Strategic ambition underestimated environmental reality. Greenland absorbed the consequences. The dangers of this mismatch became impossible to ignore in January 1968.
During a routine airborne alert mission, a U.S. B-52 bomber carrying 4 nuclear weapons crashed near Thule Air Base after an onboard fire. The aircraft broke apart on impact, scattering radioactive material across the ice and sea ice of North Star Bay. The crash exposed the reality of Arctic deterrence. Cleanup operations were extensive and hazardous. Danish and Greenlandic workers participated, often without full disclosure of risks. Although the nuclear weapons did not detonate, radioactive contamination spread. Complete recovery was impossible. The incident shattered the illusion of controlled risk. For Greenlanders, it confirmed what experience had already suggested. Global security was being managed through acceptable local danger. Throughout the Cold War, secrecy defined Greenland's role. Strategic decisions were made in Washington and NATO headquarters. Local consultation was minimal. Information flowed downward, rarely upward.
Even Denmark's oversight was constrained by alliance politics. Greenland became essential, but voiceless. As missile technology advanced, the nature of Arctic defense evolved. By the late 1960s and 1970s, intercontinental ballistic missiles reduced reliance on bomber detection. Radar systems shifted toward missile warning. Satellites entered the equation. Greenland adapted again. Thule became a site for ballistic missile early warning radar. Its location allowed tracking of launches over the Arctic. Space surveillance expanded. The island remained embedded in deterrence logic, even as the form of deterrence changed. When the Cold War ended, much of this infrastructure was reduced or placed in reserve. Personnel numbers declined. Funding shifted. Some installations were abandoned. But nothing was dismantled completely. The Arctic never returned to irrelevance. The end of the Cold War did not erase geography. It only delayed confrontation.
As the 21st century unfolded and rivalry returned, planners rediscovered what Cold War architects had known. The High North compresses distance, magnifies consequence, and exposes assumptions. Greenland's Cold War history explains why modern strategists view the island not as opportunity, but as necessity. It also explains Greenlandic caution. The memory of secrecy, displacement, and imposed risk has not faded. It shapes how Greenland responds to renewed military interest today. The Cold War did not end Greenland's strategic role. It taught Greenland what that role costs. The institutional legacy of this period extended beyond bases and radar. Greenland's integration into NATO defense planning occurred without a corresponding integration of Greenlandic political voice. Decisions were justified through alliance necessity and existential threat. Consultation was treated as impractical under conditions of urgency. This precedent mattered.
It normalized the idea that Greenland could be strategically indispensable without being politically central. That imbalance would resurface decades later, in different form. Cold War operations also reshaped Greenland's physical and social landscape. Infrastructure built for military purposes altered settlement patterns, labor markets, and transportation networks.
Airstrips became lifelines. Imported goods displaced local production. Wage labor tied communities to external systems. Dependency deepened alongside security. At the same time, Cold War secrecy delayed accountability. Many details of Arctic military activity emerged only years later through declassification and investigation. Environmental contamination, health impacts, and unresolved waste issues became subjects of public debate long after decisions were made. This delay reinforced mistrust. Greenland learned that strategic urgency rarely includes long-term responsibility.
As Arctic ice now melts and old installations re-emerge from beneath retreating ice, the Cold War has returned physically as well as politically. Abandoned sites, buried waste, and forgotten infrastructure pose new challenges under changing environmental conditions. History is resurfacing. For modern planners, Greenland's Cold War experience offers both a warning and a guide. The island is indispensable to northern defense. It is also unforgiving to assumptions. For Greenlanders, the lesson is sharper. Strategic relevance brings attention. It also brings risk. This memory informs every contemporary discussion of renewed military presence, missile defense upgrades, and Arctic security cooperation. Greenland does not approach these conversations as a blank slate. It approaches them as a place that has already paid the cost of being essential.
The militarization of Greenland during the Cold War also reshaped how the United States conceptualized sovereignty in extreme environments. Unlike traditional bases established on Allied territory, Arctic installations operated in conditions where civilian oversight was minimal and local political structures were weak or sidelined. This produced a doctrine of necessity. In Greenland, necessity justified exceptions. Environmental safeguards were relaxed. Long-term waste planning was deferred. Nuclear protocols assumed containment by isolation rather than accountability. These practices were not unique to Greenland, but the Arctic magnified their consequences. Distance delayed scrutiny. Ice concealed evidence. Time deferred responsibility. The Cold War treated the Arctic as a buffer. Greenland became the buffer's anchor.
This logic extended beyond land-based systems. The waters surrounding Greenland became zones of quiet competition. Submarines transited beneath Arctic ice, using it as concealment. Anti-submarine warfare planning increasingly factored Greenland's coastal geometry and bathymetry. Greenland was no longer only an air defense asset. It was a maritime one. This multi-domain role, air, land, sea, and later space, cemented Greenland's position in strategic planning. Few territories occupied so many layers of deterrence simultaneously. Yet this complexity never translated into political inclusion. Greenland's Cold War experience unfolded largely without Greenlandic consent, and often without full Danish transparency. Alliance politics constrained sovereignty even for the sovereign state. Greenland occupied the lowest rung in this hierarchy. The result was a layered exclusion. This exclusion mattered when the Cold War ended.
As military urgency declined in the 1990s, attention shifted elsewhere. Bases were downsized, funding receded, strategic presence thinned. Greenland was once again treated as marginal, after decades of being essential. This abrupt transition created its own instability. Infrastructure remained without purpose. Environmental issues remained unresolved. Communities adapted to the withdrawal of military economies. The Cold War left Greenland with scars, not guarantees. When Arctic interest resurged in the 21st century, it did so in a transformed context. Greenland now possessed home rule, later self-government, and an emerging political identity. It was no longer administratively silent, but strategic memory remained. For external planners, Greenland was remembered as a reliable platform. For Greenlanders, it was remembered as a place where decisions were imposed. This asymmetry shapes contemporary negotiations.
Every discussion of radar upgrades, missile defense, or expanded military presence now occurs against the background of Cold War precedent. Greenland's leaders are aware that urgency once again narrows consultation.
They resist not because they reject security, but because they remember its cost. The Cold War taught Greenland that being central does not mean being protected. It means being exposed. That lesson continues to inform how Greenland approaches renewed Arctic militarization today. Greenland's future scenarios in a multipolar world. Expanded. Greenland's future is no longer theoretical. For most of its modern history, debates about Greenland's destiny were framed as distant possibilities. Independence was an aspiration, not a timetable. Strategic interest was intermittent, not constant. Economic development proceeded cautiously, constrained by geography and scale. That era has ended.
Today, Greenland's future is being negotiated in real time, under pressure from forces that operate far beyond the island itself. Climate change, geopolitical rivalry, and technological dependence have converged to compress decision-making. Choices that once could be postponed are now unavoidable. The central question Greenland faces is not whether it matters. It already does. The question is how importance can be converted into agency rather than dependency. Independence sits at the center of this dilemma. Under the 2009 Self-Government Act, Greenland holds the legal right to pursue full sovereignty. This right is recognized under international law. Politically, it is widely accepted within Greenland as a long-term goal. Economically, it remains unresolved.
Denmark continues to provide substantial annual financial transfers that support Greenland's public services and infrastructure. These transfers stabilize the economy, but also bind it. Full independence would require replacing this revenue through domestic means. That reality forces a hard question. Where would sustainable income come from? Fishing remains the backbone of Greenland's economy, but it offers limited expansion. Tourism provides opportunity, but it is seasonal and vulnerable to environmental change. Large-scale industry is constrained by distance, energy costs, and workforce size. This leaves natural resources. Over the past 2 decades, geological surveys have identified significant deposits of rare earth elements, uranium, iron ore, and other strategic minerals in Greenland. These materials are essential to modern technologies, including batteries, renewable energy systems, and advanced electronics. Their presence transformed Greenland's economic calculus.
But resource wealth does not arrive alone. It arrives with leverage. Mining projects require foreign capital, foreign expertise, and foreign markets. Each partnership introduces influence. Each investment creates dependency risks that Greenlandic leaders understand well. The most prominent example was the Quantafield project in southern Greenland, which combined raw earth extraction with uranium byproducts. The project attracted strong international interest, including from Chinese-linked firms. Domestically, it triggered resistance. Environmental concerns were significant. Uranium mining raised fears about long-term contamination, health risks, and damage to traditional livelihoods. Public opposition grew. Political mobilization followed. In 2021, Greenland's government moved to ban uranium mining, effectively halting the project. The decision was decisive. It demonstrated that Greenland was willing to sacrifice short-term revenue to preserve environmental and political autonomy. It also sent a message to external investors. Access would be regulated, not assumed. Similar tensions emerged around infrastructure. In the late 2010s, Chinese companies expressed interest in financing and constructing airports in Greenland. On the surface, these projects addressed real needs: modernized transport, economic connectivity, and development capacity. Strategically, they raised alarms. For Denmark and the United States, Chinese involvement in critical Greenlandic infrastructure was viewed through a security lens. Airports could enable dual-use access. Investment could translate into leverage. Diplomatic intervention followed.
Denmark increased its financial involvement to limit Chinese participation. The United States reopened a consulate in Nuuk and expanded diplomatic engagement. Greenland became a site where economic development and security concerns collided openly. These episodes illustrate Greenland's current position. It is not choosing between partners. It is managing pressure. The United States seeks assurance in the Arctic, prioritizing missile defense, early warning, and alliance cohesion. China seeks access without confrontation, embedding itself through research, trade, and investment. The European Union emphasizes regulation, sustainability, and partnership. Russia seeks strategic depth and deterrence along the High North. Greenland sits among these strategies without controlling any of them. This environment complicates independence.
Full sovereignty would grant Greenland diplomatic freedom, but it would also remove Denmark's economic buffer and political shield. Remaining within the Kingdom of Denmark preserves stability but limits external maneuvering. There is no cost-free option. Greenland's leaders have responded with diversification and caution. They pursue multiple partnerships while avoiding exclusive dependence. They emphasize regulation, transparency, and environmental protection. They resist urgency-driven deals. This strategy reflects historical memory. Greenland has learned that strategic attention is not benevolent by default. It brings opportunity, but it also narrows choice. Once dependence forms, reversal is difficult. The future will not be decided by a single referendum, investment deal, or diplomatic gesture. It will emerge from accumulation, from repeated negotiations, from constrained compromises, from decisions made under pressure. Greenland's history suggests endurance.
The island has survived colonization, militarization, and neglect. It has absorbed external ambition without disappearing. That endurance may be its most valuable resource. In a multipolar world defined by competition rather than consensus, Greenland's challenge is not to escape power, but to shape how power engages with it. Whether that balance can be maintained remains uncertain. But Greenland enters this future with something it lacked in the past: voice, memory, and leverage earned through history. This balance will be tested repeatedly in the coming decades. Climate change will continue to open access faster than institutions can adapt. New shipping routes will remain uncertain, but increasingly usable. Military planners will return north more frequently, not less. Demand for critical minerals will intensify as global energy systems transition. Each of these trends increases pressure on Greenland's political capacity.
At the same time, Greenland's population will continue to debate the meaning of independence itself. Sovereignty is not only a legal condition, it is an administrative burden. Courts, defense, foreign policy, and currency management impose demands that small states must absorb carefully. Some Greenlanders argue that independence should be gradual and conditional. Others view it as a necessary assertion, regardless of cost. This debate remains unresolved. What is clear is that Greenland's future will not resemble its past. It will not be defined by isolation. It will not be defined by silence. Greenland now operates in a world that sees it clearly and watches it closely. How it navigates that attention will shape not only its own fate, but how other small, strategically placed societies manage power in an era of renewed competition. Greenland is no longer history waiting to be written. It is history unfolding.